I'm hitting start.
Give me a cue in. Good morning and welcome to another Forge Fireside. I am Brian Ellerman, the founding executive director of Arizona Forge, which is finding opportunities and resources to grow entrepreneurs. We do this monthly series primarily during the school year to talk with founders, mentors, investors, CEOs, and others about their entrepreneurial journey. This is the last Forge Fireside for the season, so I wanted to do a quick recap of who we've already had on the show before I get to today's guest. In September of last year, we had Shelley Miles, the CEO of the Singleton Foundation. October, Rafael Tapia, who has many hats, including being a mentor with Arizona Forge and leading our Native Forge program. In November, Allie Burns, the CEO of Village Capital. December, we had Santa Claus, the CEO of Christmas. January, Lynette Antolon, the founder and owner of Pueblo Vida. February, Cameron Norwood, co-founder of Pack Dash. And in March, we had Cindy Jordan, the founder and CEO of Pix Health. Today's guest is president of Flores Concepts, Ray Flores. Welcome,
Good morning.
Ray.
Thank you. Good morning.
We're going to walk through a journey here in the next, 45 or so minutes of kind of where you started out, some of the things you learned along the way. Especially want to get into some of your history. Your family has a deep history in the community and in the restaurant business. Talk a little bit about challenges. No one who has anything to do with the food and beverage industry escaped COVID unscathed, and we know just what a challenge it was. And then we always like to talk a little bit about the entrepreneurial mindset, what it means to you, and how you define it. And then, of course, maybe a look toward the future. So let's start out with, tell me a bit about you, your family, and the values that you shared, especially in the Tucson community.
Okay. Well, thank you. And as I said when I walking in this building, one of the older buildings on campus, the front of the building has this black lava rock that surrounds the outside, much like Old Main has on the foundation. And if you go to El Charro downtown, you'll note that, again, there's that black lava rock, this foundation of this building. And I kind of think that that's what, whenever we are looking at something, that's kind of what we go back to as our foundation. And we were really a family of builders. My father's father was a builder, and Monica Flynn, who founded El Charro, her father was a builder. And they came from different parts of the world. Monica's family came from France, my father's family came from Mexico, and to build things in Tucson. And so Monica's father built the cathedral for the Catholic Church back in the first cathedral here, and was commissioned by the Catholic Church to come from France to do that, and used again that black lava rock that is really representative of that building type dating back to the Old Main era of the late 1800s, mid 1800s. So I like to think that at the root of it all, we are builders. We create. So that's kind of how we've done things. In fact, when I went to the university, I started off in architecture school, and then kind of finished with like you moved from theater to science. I moved from architecture school to a sort of a quagmire of sociology and art history and whatever I could do to get out. So that's how I graduated. But definitely a foundation of building things is where we come from.
Well, and I think what you also just touched on is the importance of that solid foundation. I think it's tempting many times to, create something lightweight, easy, and consider that a foundation. But as you test time, as you move on, as you grow, the strength of that foundation becomes so critical to your success. Can you tell me a bit then how food factored in? Where, if you had this family of builders, you mentioned it was your grandmother?
It was actually my mom's great aunt who started El Charro, so my great aunt, Monica Flynn. Well, she was a young woman, and her father, Jules, was here building things. In fact, if you go to the Arizona History Museum right here on Second Avenue, or Street, they have the facade in the front, which is a rose window, et cetera. That's his work. Mm-hmm. They actually moved that from the first cathedral and put it in front of the historical museum when the building was demolished. And Monica had to was challenged with one thing. Her father had all these people working for him building things, but they weren't eating well. So she started feeding them. And that was where she started her passion and learning the types of food that the workers wanted, which were people from the region, from the area that they were building in, was a blend of this Sonoran cuisine. But she always had, she was French. She had a little bit of a French throw into things. So frying things or other that she might have learned from her native land of France, she put into the Sonoran style cooking. And that's where it really started, was her feeding others so that they could sustain and work, etc. And then eventually grew it into like a catering business. Probably then it was just feeding people as needed, and then eventually opening her own store.
Okay. I think I remember reading a story about how she didn't have enough money to keep the food on hand. So when people would come in and order, she would take their money, run next door to buy the food that she was going to prepare, come back.
Well, correct. And so, that could have been a function of not having credit to buy things and hold things. It could have been a function of simply not having refrigeration and being in a little building that she needed to go buy cold goods and come back and cook them and prepare them to eat. So at the end of the day, she kind of defined short-term credit.
All right, so I can't have you on and not ask the chimichanga story.
Yeah. So I knew we were going to get there at some point.
We had to.
But like I said, when you look at it from her background, she was somebody who had a French influence, and pan frying things was something that I'm sure came from her skill set, from family recipes, etc. So what's now considered, for instance, a yaki taco, which is that little beef fried patty taco that isn't the traditional thing that people think of tradition anyway now, the crumbled beef Taco Bell thing, but more of a yaki or native Sonoran taco. That pan frying was being done a lot. And so I'm imagining, and as Carlotta, my mother, says, there was a lot of that going on, and when they were rolling burritos, one of them supposedly fell into this oil pan. I could take it as many things. They may have used it to preserve something, because that's how they might have done something that back then, but that's the story, that she dropped a burrito into, as they called it back then, a burro. Burritos came out later on, more of a California thing. Burros were really what they were in this region because they were larger, and then burritos became smaller, and there's the name.
All right, I promise we will end it there with the chimichanga story, but I know it's legendary and
well, I mean, every great food city or food community has a story, and I think we ourselves are a little bit tired of telling the chimichanga story, but at the same time, it is history, it is part of an identity, and I think that, and then in a more modern sense, the Sonoran dog has put Tucson on the map in many ways around the world. The chimichanga story is still being told. The Sonoran dog now has got a lot of accolades for our region, so there's nothing wrong with any of that. It's all good fodder for putting a spotlight on our community and food.
Yeah. Well, and in many ways, it's an entrepreneurial story, right?
Absolutely.
It bred a new product and a new interest, and so I think to tell those pieces, it is clear that she was an entrepreneur, and everyone that followed was. So you mentioned your time at the university. You went on sort of the varied path as you came through, which I think a lot of students do. Mm-hmm. And of course, today you're working in exactly the thing you majored in, right?
No. I have used my art history stuff a lot because I found that I ended up finding a lot of fun in finishing the decor packages or setting up the restaurants the way they look and feel. So there's still a little bit of that in the architectural training involved that I went through, that it's been helpful as we build things, because it's also a passion and an enjoyment part of it to figure out how the restaurants are going to look and feel when people walk in the door, and that they tell the story of who we are and where we came from.
But we often talk with students who are stressing out about their major and can I find a job, and I keep trying to convey to them, what you major in is probably not what you're going to end up doing in life. Now, does it support you? Do you find things to draw on? I'm sure you do in many ways. But I just, biochemistry, and I'm running an entrepreneurial mindset unit, right? So it just doesn't, it is never a straight line.
No.
So I think it was in high school that you started working in the family restaurant?
Probably in really junior high, if not younger. I mean, we grew up in the restaurant. Carlotta and my father, Ray, they had taken over El Charro from a state of bankruptcy or near bankruptcy during urban renewal, which was a period where they built the convention center and they removed Hispanic families and the natives that were living in the area downtown where the TCC now sits. they had pushed a lot of people out, and they for whatever reason, obviously just for development, et cetera, and they asked Mona to close her store. So they claimed eminent domain and forced her to sell because they were going to blade the whole area, knock it down, and build the TCC. They ended up preserving the building after much public debate, but she was already out. And through lawsuits or whatever, she did not win. And so the next move was to deal with, well, how do we deal with the business? She took ill. They tried to move the business into the family home, and at that point, she got very ill. And they moved her to California for hospice. And my mother actually came out from California. I had just been born. I was a year or two, and my brother had been born. And she said, I'm going to go out to help close down the business. And when she got here, she said, I can't do it. She looked at the building, she looked at the history and the story of how her aunt had taken care of so many people, and decided that it was better that she would take it on, and told my dad, we're moving to Tucson, or back to Tucson. He didn't want to come back. Actually, it's funny, he had a little company making circuit boards, so I think we might have been better off in that business maybe. But so we moved back here, and we were little kids, and Carlotta took it over. And it's really the story of two really pioneering, hardworking, stubborn, authentic, talented women who kept this business going for 100 years. I've just been fortunate enough to tell the story and refine it as we go along.
I've never met an entrepreneur who wasn't stubborn. So, so through that work, the time at the university, the work that you've done in the restaurant, you obviously had these fantastic, role models for entrepreneurship and how that worked. What did that inform you of? We'll talk a bit about Flores Concepts in a minute, but how did you learn any lessons, or were there any things that you found later, for example, in selecting partners and people to work with, that some of your experience, both being in the restaurant and that side of it, informed you on?
Well, I've always been one who I appreciate. I learned this from. There's a guy named Richard Melman, and he's in the restaurant industry. He's in Chicago. He's a company called Let Us Entertain You. The Innovation Award, or the Concept Award that's given every year by the Restaurant Magazine, is named the Richard Melman Award. And I was fortunate some 30 years ago plus to sit down with him and ask him how he did it. And he's done much more since. And he had a legacy plan with his family, which was always interesting to me. But he said, you got to tell your story in everything you do. And if you have to, go back to that story and start over. And so I think for me, it was like, well, what if when we've gotten sidetracked, or when we start to edge away, I want to come back to what mattered. Because other restaurateurs, and Sam Fox is a friend of mine, and we've sat down and we talked about the 80-20 rule, and 80% is going to be really good, and 20% you're going to wish you never did. But it's also that reminds you of what to do and how to go back to the center. My son, who's in baseball, who I tell him, you got to get back in center. And when you've had an 0-2 strike count, you've got to look at whatever it is, get back to the center. So for me, it's getting back to where we started, and that foundation of building something that people will want to be at, people will want to eat, people will want to enjoy. And if you go back to that, and it's in our industry, that's what's important, because we are selling a good that is immediately satiable or not. It's immediately enjoyable or it's not. And that experience has all these factors around it, but that is the one that matters. And if you start there, then you can build from there.
It's a really good lesson. I know in my own baseball career, I walked more than I got hits, which made me valuable, at least in some regard.
As they say, you learn to wear it.
That's right.
Turn the shoulder.
Exactly. I think just talking about the restaurant industry, my very first job was in restaurants. I was a busboy. I worked up to server. I worked in the kitchen. I worked behind the bar. I got to know the restaurant world very well, and I think it's informed a lot of who I am today and kind of that experience. But at the same time, there's this, I don't want to say disdain, but I don't think that people fully appreciate the challenges of the restaurant world. I think people think that it's, I show up and people serve me good food and, like there's some sort of magic going on. Can you talk a little bit about, as an entrepreneur, and particularly in this industry, which is infamous for its margins, how do you see that industry, and do you think it gets the respect it deserves, or if not, what should people understand about it?
Well, I think that, unfortunately, because information travels so much faster now, we have access to things so much quicker now. I mean, walking around here, I can remember my old dot matrix printer that I had, and having to rip edges off of this thing to turn in reports, or using whiteout, out of a little jar. I think today it's so much faster that we're skipping past this human factor. And I think when you're in the hospitality industry, and I would implore everybody that is an entrepreneur or going through something or wants to develop a product for other people to purchase or to create market share with, is to understand the human nature of things. And I think the restaurant business it's like a crash course in dealing with the human nature of things. You have to tone yourself to the atmosphere that may be at that little table of two, that could be at a room full of busy bar, it could be at a patio that has a weather challenge with rain about to, it could be a million areas of where you have to tune yourself into that so that you can adapt the situation. When we open a restaurant, and my family always laughs at me, I have a hat that literally I had embroidered that says adapt on it, because we're going to have to adapt. Now, nothing against the Raising Cane's of the world or these big chain restaurants that do it really well, but I don't consider them a restaurant. I think they're a feeder. Nothing wrong with that, but I don't consider them a restaurant because I don't believe that anybody's creating anything in there. It's been created and it's just being assembled there. I think in the restaurant business that we operate, I think you have the opportunity to create. You have the consistent opportunity to create a solution for an angry guest who may have come in with a bad day, a celebration that may be a wedding announcement. It could be a celebration of life from somebody who passed. You may be dealing with all these factors in one setting. I think that gives you the opportunity to learn, to gauge yourself and how you approach something. If you're in the culinary side, you may learn systems at a restaurant like a fast food place, but when you're with us, you're going to learn how to create something from scratch, how to understand measurements and mathematics of food that go into things that create understanding volumes and exercising things involved. And then you have other factors like time and temperature that become critical to people's food safety that you may otherwise ignore at your home, but become very critical when you're producing food for 500 people. So I think there's different elements in the restaurant business that a young person or somebody going through an entrepreneurial program or wants to be an entrepreneur, I would challenge all of them to work for a few months, if not 6 months to a year. Run a season in a restaurant and see what happens. Watch what happens between what human nature is like at the end of summer and then when you hit the holidays, and just see what happens to human nature in a restaurant setting. And I think you'll learn from it if you keep your eyes open enough.
I think it's a really great takeaway, and I would absolutely echo what you said. I think many aspiring entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs would benefit, if only from the customer side of this. I I remember working in the dining room, and you would go from table to table, and it was 4 seasons in one day.
Correct.
This couple that are sitting there are just almost annoyed that you're interrupting them, and then the next one they want to talk to you, and meanwhile you have things stacking up, but you need to make sure that they feel like you're giving them the time.
Right.
Also, funny bit to my life was that was a restaurant that was all from scratch and custom. Then I went to work at Old Chicago, which gave me a 3-ring binder with specifications of how long the carrot stick should be and everything. And and so I totally appreciate your comment about sort of factory outlets, if you will.
Right, and they're wonderful, and you want to get part of your operation to that. You do want to, we have a commissary model in our company because we realized when we started getting into airports, there was no way we were going to be able to execute in these very tight spaces the kind of volumes or the kind of food we were doing without some kind of centralized production facility. And then, of course, food safety comes into where you're dealing with government overlay. We have, which all entrepreneurs will deal with some kind of government structures. We have USDA, FDA, Pima County Health, City of Tucson, Fire and Safety, OSHA. We deal with all of that in our own little, in our own little hemisphere. So, and it does teach you that documentation and putting your ducks in a row are very important when you're making any kind of thing with any kind of process.
Let's talk. We're kind of touching on the challenges side. So let's talk a little bit about that. You're talking about your commissary model, which sounds to me like that was how you address the topic of scale and growth. Are there other things that you can offer to aspiring entrepreneurs in understanding? We talk a lot about the paradox or sort of the double-edged sword of success is that, yay, people really like you, but they like what you were, and as you grow, how do you maintain that identity, that culture as you expand? So we've
had that happen to us where people have they've called it I think there's a friend of mine that's on radio that calls it the Charro Sphere. There's another one that called the Charro Empire. Heard those. It's just all kind of crazy because it's still a pretty tight family-run business. But we focused on building, we had this opportunity to get this commissary model through, it was really happen chance. We thought we were going to be great to put our food into grocery stores. And everybody that makes food or something or has a sauce that they love always thinks it's easy to get in a grocery store. It's the toughest thing in the world to get in a grocery store. And it's really a brutal business because their structures are so different than what you're used to, and they have a very, I don't want to say it's selfish, but it can be. They have buybacks where if it doesn't sell, you've got to buy back what you sold them. I mean, you learn all these things, and then of course they have slotting fees and marketing fees, and there's just so many decision makers, and they change a lot. So getting into like Price Club back then was one of our goals, and we got into Price Club. And I was on the road doing road trips for Price Club to different markets trying to get our product to move, et cetera. And we learned that, that just wasn't for us. And we were making too many things for too many people. And it wasn't refined enough. And we had to scale back down and make food for one group. And at that time, we were fortunate. We started making food for the Basha family when they just started purchasing their Food City outlets, which were their Hispanic grocery stores. And that really taught us a lot. And then refinement from there was, hey, look, let's take care of our own really well. And what do we need to do for what's going to help us grow? And that's where the commissary model was successful, because we could then get into licensing, which helped us into airports, or like what we did when we went into the MGM, because the MGM with their labor issues was challenged to keep restaurants open. So a model like ours, where we came to them and said, hey, look, we can provide you a core bank of recipes and ingredients that can go into things that you don't have to pay for somebody to stand there and watch a kettle boil with food. It was attractive enough to them to keep a unit open that was probably a dinosaur. It was a massive restaurant that they needed to solve for that was right by the arena. So we were a solution to that. We've been a solution to airports. We're in the university concessions. We're a solution to that because, again, you don't have cooking facilities inside McHale. It's an older facility without any of that. So having a model like ours, we can come in and execute food efficiently and with safety and hopefully with some quality. And if that seems like it's empire-like, I think it's really just more intelligent.
Well, speaking of the empire, I noticed that it's called Flores Concept and not called El Charro Concepts. Can you talk a little bit about, that naming and I guess your experience on the intellectual property front?
When you're growing up in a family business, and those of you who have had that, or you'll hear this terminology that says, a business run by a family, not a family business. There's all these consultants and people out there that'll throw out these little, sayings that they like. And that's one that always stuck with me was, you're a family business, but you need to be a business run by a family, not a family run by a business. And so for us, when we got into multi-growth or had multi-branded issues, Flores Concepts made sense from a management company. That's all that is. It does payroll. It does accounting. It's not a sexy restaurant. It's a management company. So that's what Flores Concepts does. That's why it made sense for us to name it that. Plus, and we can talk a little bit about, you said IP, correct? El Charro started in 1922, maybe even a little earlier from family stories. El Charro wasn't protected by Monica. She didn't think she was going to grow, and she definitely didn't understand trademark law or didn't have good counsel for that. And she did not trademark the El Charro name. When I got involved with the family's business shortly after college and we wanted to grow, the first one was to grow into Tucson Airport. And we found out that we couldn't simply do a licensing deal because the El Charro name wasn't owned by us. So to do a licensing deal for them, it was very difficult. So we went around and started looking at how to do it. And at the end of the day, we were able to surround the mark with other Charro steaks and C Charro and Charro Vita and things like that. But to go and try and grow El Charro, it was going to be difficult from a pathway. Because by then, 1970 came around and Elvis made a movie called Charro. And between 1970 and 74, tons of El Charros opened up all around the country. And there was no way we could stop them. They also couldn't stop us. And eventually the trademark office just said the brand is diffused. You can open as many El Charros as you want, or you can open as many you want. Well, why would you want to raise a bunch of money or finance that endeavor? So we started growing other items, other brand types, and that's been a lot of fun too, and that's why Flores Concepts needed to manage something. So
got it, understood. And I think it's an important lesson, I think, at least to those entrepreneurs who are early going. You don't necessarily expect the success, but you need to be planning for it and thinking about it, because it's far better to have maybe done some of those early stage protections and not need it than it is to find yourself now successful and everybody knows about you, and now there are 5 more of those same things diluting your brand.
I've found that protecting our intellectual, I don't even know if intellectual property is like a term that I like. I think our intellectual creative abilities, or what we do, has also created other things.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, when we were looking at the next restaurant to name something Charro, which we were doing, Charro Steak came up because we were looking around and I had some microfiche sent to me there was a Charro, an El Charro in Casa Grande that a family member owned, and my mother didn't even remember it. That had, and their advertisement, it was like from the 40s, was the same food as El Charro featuring steak. And I was like, bing, that's it. We've got to do Charro Steak. And so I think in the process of protection, you may even find a better answer than what you thought you had going into it. Great
lesson. Quick plug to those of you who are tuning in. On the 26th, we will actually have Steve Koziol, who is the West Coast Director for the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, will be here in town and doing office hours. So if anybody is interested, follow up with us or with Startup Tucson. Because I think it's great to start getting that advice and asking those kinds of questions. And is there a there? Is this something I can protect? Or if it's not, what do I build?
Absolutely. And you can imagine Monica didn't have the old interweb to go to and like do a search and do a quick USPTO, Boolean or quick fast search that they have those things. So you can look pretty quickly to see things, and then you can go out and spend money after that. But you can do a lot of work on your own.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
So let's jump into a bit more, like coming up to the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and its impact on you and your business. Because at that point, you had how many properties were open when the pandemic struck in 2020?
Well, all in, it probably shut down 15 or 16 affiliated restaurants. Maybe a little, maybe more, maybe 17. I'd have to count, but it's between 15 and 18 restaurants that we had, between licensed operations, between our USDA plant, between catering companies, between concession groups, and of course our brick and mortar restaurants. So, everybody heard about it. I think on the West Coast we were a little slower to react, obviously, than the East Coast because it started off in New York. We had a restaurant in Baltimore Airport, and through connections there, we had heard that Starbucks was closing shop. And just do the math. If Starbucks does that, it's a domino. They're going to close everywhere because they have insurance and they have investors and they have a public company. They're not going to just close the segment without addressing the whole issue from a national standpoint or global. And so I thought, well, this is coming our way. And I remember going to city and county people, and they're like, no, it's not here yet. Let's not overthink it. And I'm like, no, I think it's coming because business is coming. Because business like Starbucks doesn't take this lightly. We can't. Because there's going to be a health scare which is going to come into it. So Starbucks thinks more about public health than I do. So I had to think along the lines of how they thought. And one of the things that I stressed about, and I got some grief about it because I wasn't for the shutdown, but I was definitely for intelligent decisions. And the intelligent decision was if we get supported by the government to shut us down, we can claim force majeure. If we can claim force majeure, we can then stop our leases. We can protect ourselves. Everybody else wanted to fight this fight. I'm like, no. This isn't a fight to fight. This is a path to go. And so for us, it was more about being smart about what would happen to our business if we just simply shut down or if we shut down with a due process. So that then led to being able, I think, to also map out a smart shutdown and then an intelligent recovery.
And, we don't have to dive into the specifics, but I mean, from the point of view of making it through, I hear stories from a lot of folks who had to make difficult decisions, in some cases laying off staff, in other cases, covering them to some extent. How did you weather the storm with your staff and, when you came back out of it?
It was one of the hardest days of my life. We sat in a room, and I remember the governor was on the television that we had in our conference, in our corporate office, whatever, and I laid off almost 500 people, and and then of course had to think about, well, they're going to allow us to do this, and we were still have a lot of interplay with the health department and what's going to be allowed for takeout food. And then there was that CNN thing with the sneezing in the Chinese restaurant where everybody died, and all this stuff was going on, you know. And you're getting all this information, you're not sure, and I'm a father with 2 children in school, what's going to happen, and all those worries. And making that decision, we didn't have any knowledge of PPP at the time. We didn't have any of that. So all we knew was what we didn't know. And the USDA, who we operate with, thought, well, if you just do your HACCP plan, you should be fine. HACCP has time and temperature. This has nothing to do with time and temperature. This is an airborne virus, and you're telling me time and temperature is going to matter. I just don't think anybody really knew. Yeah. And that was the hardest part. And of course, it's also been the most divisive part of it.
Yeah, the division is subject for another show,
right.
I think.
Exactly.
You know, but I think from the business perspective, it was tough on everybody, and it sounds like it was especially difficult for you. How well have you recovered from that today, if you've got a sense of where things are at?
Well, we lost our restaurant in Las Vegas. MGM decided to go a different path over that time. They shut down. They were shut down for quite a while and a lot longer. And of course, we were back in the entertainment district of the MGM there by the Grand Arena, so their venue was shut down even longer. And by then, they just decided to go a different route. So we did lose that. It was hard for our airport partners, you know, and really tough for them. Reopening was like, again, we reopened everything at once. So it was, I aged really badly quickly because we were opening everything back up at once, inclusive of a new menu type with these plastic things that we built and, you know, stupid screens in front of us and people in masks and, oh, let's get branded masks. You know, that was an entrepreneurial move. And so these things just, everything happened in this little funnel, and we had to, it was more like a cyclone. Now that we've kind of, that has calmed down, we truly are in some ways better off. In other ways, I feel like we all have that gray hair that was in that Superman movie or whatever. Like they was like, oh, you aged, you know. We all have that, like this one streak that we're going to live with forever. And I think businesses will have that for a long time right now. And maybe a part of it is access to talent. It might be where people are just all taking a second break about, hey, we're not sure what we want to, you know, second breath rather, where we want to go next. And so I feel like it's been harder to hire people, been harder to get people to stick. I think customers are a little bit more on edge, although I think that's waning. I think we did have a pent-up demand, which was nice. They came back strong, but that also means they came back strong and in need, which, you know, as you said, the 4 seasons, everybody was like, now. It wasn't like, hey, I'm cool, I'll wait for, you know, my table. It was not that way. So, I think it galvanized you. I think it made you a little callous, the return. And I think if you made it through, you're probably going to last for a while, because it was definitely, you know, this generation's World War that we went through and how to get back from it.
I think that's a really good analogy. As someone who probably eats at the Monica nearly every week,
you're a really smart guy. I didn't know that you were this smart.
I have personally observed a bit of an evolution, you know, in terms of how what's offered, how things are positioned. And to me, I would think fast casual as a way to kind of get back into things, you know, was probably perfectly positioned because of the fact that it was the minimal contact, right? I walk down a line, I make my order, and then it shows up at my table, and like that's the extent of it.
Absolutely.
Has that been your experience? And you know, does the Monica serve in any way as a bit of a laboratory, or is it just that it's a different model and so it's showing different things from some of the weight?
I think all the above of what you just said, and the fact that you've seen that. When we did it, originally that was supposed to be a large food hall. There was a 2-story food hall that was supposed to be in that building.
And a bowling alley, if I remember right.
And COVID killed that, right? Because of, you know, while bowling wasn't going to work, and there was a big brand called Punch Club Social that was really growing at the time before COVID, and then went bankrupt. And we were like, oh my God, no bowling alley, none of this public fun stuff that we can do, and definitely not a bunch of congested food hall type applications. That was not something that we decided we wanted to open with right after COVID. So the Monica came about more like this open air modern cafeteria, in the sense of, well, if cafeterias used to feed schools and large casinos full of people, if we have to feed a large group of downtown people, why don't we build something like a modern day cafeteria? And so that's kind of where it started, and we started looking around at different concepts around town. around the country, and we like the idea of this bar / fast casual with this modern setting. We were fortunate to have a large outdoor area, which I think even today, I think people still really want to eat outside. Anybody that has any fear or trepidation about COVID or airborne illnesses, maybe if they have an immune issue, I think the outdoor patio has been really successful for us. So I would, in our industry, I would say you're going to see a lot more patio dining, and of course the parklets that the cities allowed, and you see cities all around still allowing people to eat outside on sidewalks and all. I think that's going to stick, and it's going to stay for a long time. I mean, it happens in Europe, right? It's all over Europe, and it just happens to be, it should have been here all along.
I agree. Yeah. Well, especially if we want to try to keep encouraging people not to drive, but to use other forms of transit.
To live outside and to work outside, yeah.
Yeah, well, full disclosure, we call the Monica the Forge Cafeteria, just saying. So we spend a lot of time there.
Can we license that?
I think we could work something out. So let's jump. This is kind of where I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions from the audience. But we always like to talk about the entrepreneurial mindset and how you would define it when you hear that terminology. And my understanding, or at least the way that I think what I've heard today is that customer and the customer experience is always going to be more important than, let's say, the financial side of this. Is that fair, or is there something else to the entrepreneurial mindset for you?
I think that has to be balanced. I do fear a sense that, and maybe again, being a little bit older or not as attuned to some of the things you all are going through every day with Forge and these younger entrepreneurs, et cetera. But I do fear that there's a mindset that we must hit the moonshot every time, as was popular with the Reddit craziness and all that. I fear that people wouldn't be okay anymore with a 15% return. It's just not okay anymore. We've got to triple up our money too fast. And I think sometimes I fear, I don't know that if I walked into a VC group and said, hey, I have this plan for these restaurants that I would ever even get looked at. I think but yet 100 years, multiple growth, employed a lot of people, done a lot of good for the community, et cetera, et cetera. It's not as sexy as the moonshot, Ray. But how many moonshots fail? Mm-hmm. They love to talk about restaurants and the rate of failure or the mortality rate of restaurants. But what about the mortality rate of the moonshot? And I think that, unfortunately, there's a lot of young people and people in general in business that just are still looking and craving that moonshot. And look, we all do. I mean, who wouldn't want to be the Chipotle? Who wouldn't want to be the Cane's Chicken guy? But there's also who might not have a nice family life with a good return on your investment, structure, own your home, et cetera. I fear about, for me anyway, what's out there, because there aren't that many moonshots. Mm-hmm. And I think safe is okay too. And there's a balance, like how much risk and how much security. Be careful with that.
Well, so what you're touching on in my mind, it has to do with what we like to call patient capital. Mm-hmm. I think that venture tends to be impatient capital. It wants to see that return inside of a few years, and there's maybe a lack of patient capital, at least in the large sense. I think there are all kinds of entities doing smaller things. Community Investment Corporation, for example, has a fantastic set of low and no interest loans and other things. But those are 10 to 50,000 at the high end, mm-hmm. which is great to start that first thing. But now I need $2 million or what have you. The number of opportunities is lower. And I think what you're touching on is the fact that there are very healthy business ideas out there and businesses that need to find that financial backing, just the same as the one that's super sexy, that, as you called it, the moonshots. But is entrepreneurial mindset about, so it's not chasing that elusive moonshot, but rather recognizing where there's opportunity to do something innovative in a business capacity? Is that?
Yeah, so you mentioned the book from Old Chicago and that systems and structure. Look, I mean, if you are going to go for the moonshot, like in my industry, you got to have that. Mm-hmm. You got to have the systems and the structures to get there. An idea is fine, but it's only an idea. It's not an actual operation. So I think for all of us, when you look at your business or you look at what you're going to develop, how are you going to operate it? And if you're not going to operate it because you see an exit, the exit's only as good as whoever can operate it, right? Who's going to operate that, or how are they going to operate it without you? I think that's forgotten a lot. And so for us, we're trying to work more and more on how do we operate every day. and how does it function every day? May not make money right away because we may be tweaking it just like anything else, but I think the operation of it really matters. So that's pretty deep conversation for us because there's multiple things involved. But if you're just there and you've got this great idea here and you're here, when you get there, if you haven't documented all those processes and made sure those processes are tested and they're valid and they weren't just lucky, and even if they're lucky, then they can still be duplicated. Those are the things that I kind of think about for an entrepreneur is like, did we test that? Did we test that model? Can it be vetted? Can it be proved again and again and again? And I think like when you think about Chipotle in our industry, it was proved again and again and again. But at the same time, the market bore onto them that they needed to execute that at this price point, right? People didn't want it at this price point, they wanted it at that. And then what ended up happening to them was their supply chain bounced back at them and they had to go buy food that was at risk, and then they put people at risk, and they had foodborne illness issues, and they had supply chain issues and that. So again, maybe they tested it to this point, but they didn't test it to this point. And when they got to this point over here, just because the market drove it and people wanted it, they weren't ready, and they hit some certain, and critically dangerous walls that made people sick. So they've rebounded and they fixed it, and that happens in work. But yeah, testing your model over and over again. I work with a local developer named Don Bourne, and he always is talking about how many models they run for his projects. And he says, they'll run hundreds of models. And so that's not a bad thing.
No.
It takes time, but that's the fun part of it too. That's what you want to look back on, right? You want to look back and like, man, I had a lot of ideas, all these models, and keep them in a drawer somewhere, even if they're written on Kleenex, like keep them, because they can remind you of things. I have a book of like all these articles that we keep, and I go through it every now and then, like, oh God, remember that haircut, and all that stuff helps. So.
Well, what I love about what you've just described is something coming out from a science background. It's the scientific method, right? It's writing out an experiment, saying, here's my hypothesis, here are the conditions that I'm keeping constant, here's the variable, run the experiment and then see if the outcome matches what I thought it was, and if not. And so bringing that scientific discipline to entrepreneurship is really what I think we're trying to get to and trying to coach. And I think what you've described is exactly it. Yeah. Ben, do we have some questions?
Absolutely, we do. Just to let you know, for time, we're at about 9:42 right now. And we've got 3 questions here. So the first one is, what advice do you have for college students that are wanting to get into the restaurant and catering business? Or what do you wish that you knew when you were starting out?
Well, I wish I knew accounting better when I started out. I wish I'd spent time in college or probably applied accounting somewhere, learning accounting better. That's definitely something that I wish I knew better. Over time, what I've learned more about and what's become, I think, more important to me in our restaurant business, besides that, has been dealing with real estate and that process, because we're building brick and mortar, or we're opening brick and mortar. So, being more aware of our real estate structures and documents and whatever have you, those have become very important to us. As far as getting into the trade, I'm not a chef. I don't pretend to be. I've got great chefs. In fact, I want to give a shout out to my main chef and homeboy, Gary Hickey. It's his birthday today.
Yeah.
So happy birthday, Gary. I'm not a chef, but I'm extremely interested in food. So do you find yourself while you're in college looking at something like, I love this, or I love something about something? Because I think there is an element of passion to it. However, at the same time, it could be very simply like a system-minded person may be very good at developing an idea on how to feed the masses. And it could come from another industry completely. There's been some very good approaches taken from engineering of food and other things that are out there to try and feed the masses. That is something that's going to have to be addressed. One of the things that we're very involved with the university is the community school garden program right now. That really doesn't have to do anything with catering or restaurants, but I find myself and my chef team and the people that work with us, and we have a relationship with Shamrock Foods as the university does, and they're very involved with us. We go and look at these children growing food in schools all over Tucson's Unified School District. The university's involved with it. It started off as a behavioral health solution. It was a doctor here, Moses Thompson, who said, hey, I think I can help kids stay in school. I'm going to teach them, we're going to start gardening to keep some of these kids to stay, just to come back to school the next day. And all of a sudden it bore this amazing system in Tucson where we have the most school gardens per capita, in the state, and we've got this great program where these children are learning about sustainability and also enriching their lives emotionally and psychologically, which we all know that's part of being an entrepreneur. You're going to get stressed out. Well, what if you get stressed out and you also have a great garden outside the door? So I think it's good to be involved with food in general. How you want to apply it, that's up to you.
I'm also not a chef, but I'm an experienced user.
Yep.
Another question.
All right. Our next question is, what new or progressive practices are you either excited to implement into your business in the future, or are you kind of working on right now?
Delivery was really difficult for us, the food delivery stuff, the Grubhubs and the DoorDashes. So that was technology that came about with the gig economy or the e-economy, whatever you want to call it. That was tough for us because number one, we build restaurants. They're designed to execute X amount of seats, X amount of volume, and then all of a sudden you can have an entire other business model coming in, crashing your kitchen right at 7 o'clock at night, right? And if you go, for instance, Chipotle, like we've talked about, they're now building stores with 2 kitchens inside of them, 2 lines, one for the online business and one for what comes in the front door. So we couldn't do that. We couldn't go. We couldn't even physically do it. We didn't have the setup to do that. So the technology part of that challenged us. But on the other side, of course, technology with point of sale gives us a solution like the Monica, because it's not only a solution for speed of service, but it's also a model where, because of, for instance, gratuities or other, it's allowed for some parity between our back of house and front of house personnel. So you got to face technology with an open mind even in an older business model like what we have, and apply what you think will work in a smart sense and slow walk it. And then, if something comes at you fast, don't be afraid to pause. We only took on one delivery partner. We didn't do business with all of them. We couldn't. We looked at one of them. We looked at what they were willing to charge for their fees, and we made a negotiated with one. Taking on all comers probably would have been really hard for us to execute. And then not being foolish enough to think that we could deliver a lobster on, DoorDash. It wasn't going to work. So.
Excellent. Last question we have here. I personally really like this one. It's a 2-parter. First, what are some of your favorite restaurants in the Tucson area that aren't a part of the El Charro family?
I like Tito and Pep. I think he does a really good job. My family eats a lot at this little Greek place, Mediterranean place called Opa. I will always respect and support Danny from Vivace because he was always cool with me, and him and my mom were always cool together. I think with the City Gastronomy, there's a lot of people on there. Like, Mateo from Rolli's worked with me when we had cervezas, and I can see some cervezas in his food, and I'm like, that's cool that he's doing so well. And the folks that own Scented Leaf, they work for me with a different company that I own, and they have this cool little tea thing, and we still talk together. And Grant from Union and Reforma and those folks, they're good people. So we're friends. The funny thing about the community of restaurants in Tucson is they're competitors, but they really are supportive of each other. So I'd say there's a lot of them. The Travis and the Parish guys do great. There's just a lot of people out there that work hard at what they do and are really passionate, and they care about Tucson, and that shows in what they put out every day.
Well, I'm glad you touched on the community. The second part of the question is, what are some of the things that you see our local restaurants here in Tucson collectively doing really well?
City Gastronomy. The mindset that we have this, what to many may just see like a badge of marketing honor, and it's a good marketing tool, is really actually a culture being built within for sustainability, food knowledge, food safety. It's education based. It's teaching. Like I said, the food. We were on a tour with people from City Gastronomy, and our Visit Tucson, our Visiting Tucson is our marketing arm for our community to outside Tucson, and they're involved with school gardens. We on that same tour, we had people from TMC, from the medical team that was there, because they want to be involved with food sustainability. So I think I think the City Gastronomy title or structure gave birth to a lot of thinking about what it means to be that, and it's all been pretty positive.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time in speaking with us today.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great.
This is, as I mentioned, our final Forge Fireside for the season. We'll be back in the fall. In the meantime, thanks very much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.